Margaret Holloway was 87 years old when she finally allowed the story to be told. By then, she lived alone in a quiet retirement apartment in Savannah, Georgia, a place where the air smelled faintly of salt and magnolia blossoms. To anyone who passed her in the hallway, she looked like any other elderly woman: soft gray hair pinned neatly, careful steps, hands that trembled slightly when she lifted her teacup. People saw age. They saw fragility. What they did not see was the long shadow of a secret that had once stretched across an entire marriage. For more than 60 years, Margaret had carried a memory that returned to her every night at the same hour, as if time itself had been wounded and never healed. She had told no one. Not her children, not her neighbors, not even the priest who visited the building once a week. Silence had seemed safer. But old age has a way of loosening the locks people place on their past. When a person reaches the final chapters of life, the truth begins to feel heavier than the fear of telling it. And so Margaret began her story, not because she wanted sympathy, but because she believed that sometimes the smallest instinct, the quiet voice people ignore, can be the only warning they will ever receive. Margaret had not always been a solitary woman surrounded by memories. In the early 1950s, she had been young, hopeful, and eager to build the life that everyone around her expected. She grew up in a small town outside Savannah, where the river determined the rhythm of everything: trade, work, weather, even conversation. Families there valued endurance more than happiness. A good life meant stability, routine, and the ability to keep difficult thoughts to yourself. Women were raised to believe that marriage was not about passion or understanding. It was about loyalty, patience, and quiet resilience. Margaret believed that as firmly as anyone. When she married Thomas Holloway in the autumn of 1956, she did so with the calm confidence of someone stepping into a future she thought she understood. Thomas worked at a shipping yard along the harbor, supervising freight that moved in and out by rail and barge. The job was steady and respectable. He was known as a serious man: quiet, responsible, dependable. Those were qualities people admired. In a town where loud personalities often caused trouble, a silent man seemed trustworthy. Their home was small but respectable, a narrow wooden house with a porch that faced the street and a backyard shaded by a single oak tree. The walls were thin and the floors creaked whenever someone crossed the hallway, but Margaret kept the place spotless. She cooked carefully planned meals, sewed curtains, and planted flowers near the porch steps in spring. From the outside, their life appeared exactly the way a respectable marriage was supposed to look. Neighbors waved politely. The couple attended church every Sunday. Thomas worked hard and paid every bill on time. Margaret took pride in making their house feel warm and orderly. For several years, nothing seemed unusual enough to question. If there was distance between them, it was the sort many marriages quietly accepted. Thomas rarely spoke about his workday, and he was not affectionate, but Margaret had been warned not to expect tenderness from a husband. Her own mother used to say that love was something proven through duty rather than words. A man showed love by staying, by working, by keeping a roof over his family. Margaret believed that explanation completely. They eventually had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both born with the help of a midwife who lived a few streets away. Margaret devoted nearly all her time to raising them. Thomas held each baby once or twice with an awkward uncertainty and then returned to the routines that made him comfortable. He was never cruel, never angry, simply distant. It was as if a quiet wall existed inside him that no one could pass through. During the day, the household followed a steady pattern. Mornings were filled with laundry and breakfast dishes. Afternoons passed with radio music drifting through the kitchen while the children napped. Evenings were quiet. Thomas read the newspaper, finished his supper, and went to bed early. To most people, that kind of calm life would have seemed like success. Margaret told herself the same thing whenever a faint uneasiness crept into her thoughts. She reminded herself that other women endured far worse. Some neighbors whispered about husbands who drank too much or came home shouting. Others hid bruises beneath sleeves. Compared to those stories, her marriage looked peaceful. But peace and silence are not always the same thing, and sometimes a quiet house can hide things no one expects to find. Looking back many years later, Margaret realized there had been small warnings long before the nights changed. Thomas disliked unexpected visitors and would stiffen whenever someone knocked suddenly on the door. He checked the locks more often than necessary, sometimes twice before going to bed. Certain subjects made him withdraw into silence, particularly anything related to the river or the old shipping docks further down the harbor. When Margaret asked innocent questions about his work history, he answered briefly and then changed the topic. At the time, she dismissed these habits as personality quirks. Every marriage, she believed, contained mysteries that were better left undisturbed. Curiosity, she had been taught, could damage a household faster than ignorance. Then one winter night, everything began to change. Margaret woke suddenly, though she could not explain what had disturbed her. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the alarm clock across the dresser. At first, she thought she had imagined the sensation that pulled her from sleep. But then she felt something unmistakable, the awareness that someone was standing nearby. Slowly, she opened her eyes. A figure was beside the bed. Thomas stood there barefoot on the wooden floor, perfectly still. His shoulders were stiff, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. For a moment, Margaret believed he might be sleepwalking. She waited for him to move or speak. He did neither. He simply stood beside her, staring somewhere past the bed as though he were listening to something she could not hear. The silence in the room felt unnaturally heavy. Margaret's heart pounded loudly in her chest, but fear prevented her from saying his name. After several long seconds, Thomas turned, walked back around the bed, and lay down again. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into the deep rhythm of sleep. Margaret remained awake until morning, telling herself she must have misunderstood what she saw. The following night it happened again. When Margaret woke this time, the glowing red numbers on the alarm clock read 3:12 a.m. Thomas was already standing beside her, motionless in the darkness. The pattern repeated the next evening, and the one after that. Every night, always at the same hour, he rose from bed and stood there silently. He never touched her, never spoke, never even seemed to acknowledge that she might wake and notice him. During the day, he behaved exactly as usual, calm and composed, with no hint that anything strange had occurred. When Margaret asked if he had been sleeping well, he looked mildly confused and said he rested perfectly. Gradually, doubt began to creep into her thoughts. Perhaps exhaustion was causing her imagination to wander. Perhaps she was misinterpreting ordinary movements in the dark. But fear rarely grows without nourishment, and something in those quiet nightly moments felt deeply wrong. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began noticing details she had ignored before. Thomas seemed unusually alert in the mornings following those midnight rituals, as if standing in the dark had sharpened his senses rather than tired him. His attention drifted frequently toward the windows of the house instead of toward his family. He listened carefully whenever a car passed slowly outside, or when footsteps sounded on the sidewalk. The time, 3:12 a.m., stopped being just a number on the clock. It became a moment Margaret dreaded long before it arrived. Every night, she waited for the quiet shift of the mattress, the soft creak of the floorboards, and the unsettling presence that followed. And although she still did not understand why Thomas stood there, one thought began to settle into her mind with increasing certainty. Whatever he was doing in the darkness had nothing to do with sleep. The feeling that something unseen was approaching their home slowly grew stronger. Margaret could not yet explain it, but deep inside, she sensed that those silent minutes at 3:12 were not the beginning of the mystery. They were only the warning. The weeks that followed slowly began to erode Margaret Holloway's sense of normal life. At first, she tried to dismiss what she had seen as a strange, but harmless habit. People did unusual things in their sleep. Doctors on the radio sometimes talked about sleepwalking or restless minds. She told herself that Thomas was simply wandering through the night without realizing it. But the pattern was too exact to ignore. Every night he rose from the bed at precisely 3:12 a.m. The moment the clock's red digits shifted to that time, the mattress would move slightly as he sat up. Then his bare feet would touch the floor. The wooden boards would creak once, maybe twice, as he crossed the room. And finally, he would stand beside Margaret's side of the bed, silent and still, like someone waiting for something that never arrived. Margaret's sleep gradually became shallow and nervous. Instead of drifting into rest, she found herself lying awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling while the house breathed quietly around her. She counted the minutes, listening to every sound the building made, the distant hum of passing cars, the occasional bark of a dog down the street, the whisper of wind brushing the oak tree outside the window. As midnight slipped past and the house settled into deeper silence, a tight pressure would begin to grow in her chest. She knew the moment was coming. She always knew. When the time finally arrived, her body would tense before the clock even changed. Sometimes she watched the numbers carefully as they ticked forward. Other nights she pretended to sleep, closing her eyes just before 3:12 appeared. Either way, the result was always the same. Thomas would rise. He would stand beside her bed. And then he would return to sleep as if nothing had happened. During the day, however, Thomas seemed completely ordinary. He left for work at the harbor just before sunrise, his lunch pail tucked under his arm. In the evenings he returned with dust on his boots and the smell of salt water clinging faintly to his jacket. He ate supper quietly, read the newspaper, and went to bed early. Margaret watched him closely, searching for signs of strain or exhaustion, but he looked no more tired than usual. If anything, he seemed slightly more alert, as though those silent moments in the darkness were sharpening something inside him rather than draining his energy. The contrast unsettled her more than the behavior itself. If Thomas had appeared exhausted or confused, she might have believed the explanation of sleepwalking. But there was nothing uncertain in his movements. The way he crossed the room felt deliberate and practiced. He never stumbled. He never hesitated. It was as if he were performing a ritual he had memorized long ago. Margaret began to question him cautiously. One evening while washing dishes, she asked if he had been having trouble sleeping lately. Thomas looked up from the newspaper, puzzled. "Not that I know of," he replied calmly. "Why do you ask?" "You've seemed restless," she said carefully. He shrugged and returned to reading. "Probably just work." The conversation ended there. Thomas was not a man who enjoyed discussing personal matters. When he considered a topic closed, he had a quiet but firm way of ending it. Margaret had learned long ago that pushing further would only produce silence. Still, her unease continued to grow. The first truly alarming sign appeared one cold morning in early spring. Margaret stepped outside onto the porch to shake a rug and noticed something unusual near the front steps. There were muddy footprints in the yard, dark shapes pressed into the soft soil near the walkway. They led toward the house, but seemed to stop abruptly near the porch. She stood there staring at them for a long moment. It had not rained recently. The ground had been dry for days. Margaret knelt and touched the soil. It was damp, almost wet, as though the mud had been carried from somewhere else. She followed the prints carefully with her eyes. They were not deep enough to belong to heavy work boots, but they were larger than a child's shoes. For a brief moment she wondered if someone had walked through the yard during the night. The thought sent a ripple of unease through her chest. Thomas had already left for work, and the children were still sleeping inside. Margaret wiped the footprints away with the edge of the rug, though she could not explain why she felt compelled to erase them. Perhaps she simply did not want the children to see them and start asking questions. That evening she mentioned the footprints casually during supper. "Did you step outside during the night?" she asked. Thomas paused for a fraction of a second before answering. "No." His voice was steady, but something about the way he avoided looking directly at her made Margaret's stomach tighten. The next morning the footprints were back. This time they were closer to the porch. Margaret stood in the yard staring at them with growing confusion. She tried to imagine innocent explanations. Perhaps a neighbor had crossed the yard by mistake. Perhaps a delivery boy had walked through while she slept. But the arrangement of the prints did not support those theories. They formed a short path toward the house, and then simply ended, as if the person who made them had vanished. Margaret began checking the doors and windows each night before going to bed. She locked the back door carefully and tested the handle twice. She pulled the curtains tightly across every window. She even placed a wooden chair against the front door as a quiet precaution. The following morning the chair had been moved back against the wall. The door was still locked. Margaret stood in the hallway staring at it, her hands trembling slightly. She did not remember moving the chair. For the rest of that day, a heavy tension followed her from room to room. She tried to behave normally for the children, helping them with homework and preparing supper as usual, but her thoughts kept circling the same disturbing question. If the chair had been moved, who had moved it? When Thomas returned from work that evening, she studied him more closely than ever before. His face looked tired, but not in the way someone appears after a long day of labor. It was a deeper kind of exhaustion, like the strain of holding something hidden for too long. At one point, he glanced toward the front window suddenly, as though expecting someone to appear outside. The movement was quick but unmistakable. Margaret felt a chill crawl up her spine. That night she lay awake again, staring at the clock. 3:10, 3:11, 3:12. Thomas sat up. He crossed the room as usual and stood beside her bed. But this time Margaret noticed something new. He was not looking at her. He was facing the window. His body was angled toward the dark glass, as if he were listening for a sound somewhere outside the house. The realization sent a wave of cold fear through Margaret's chest. He wasn't watching her. He was watching something beyond the walls. Or waiting for it. The minutes stretched painfully long. Thomas remained perfectly still, his attention fixed on the night outside. Finally, he turned and returned to bed, falling asleep within moments. Margaret did not sleep at all. The next morning the muddy footprints appeared again, closer than before. And for the first time Margaret began to consider a possibility that frightened her more than anything she had imagined so far. What if Thomas was not standing beside the bed because of something inside the house? What if he was waiting for someone outside to arrive? That thought lingered in Margaret's mind for the rest of the day, like a dark cloud that refused to move. And the longer she considered it, the more certain she became that whatever was approaching their home had not come yet. But it was getting closer. By the beginning of summer, the quiet fear inside Margaret Holloway had grown into something far heavier than suspicion. It followed her through every room of the house and settled beside her every night when the lights went out. Sleep no longer brought rest. It brought anticipation. Each evening felt like the slow walk toward a moment she could neither escape nor fully understand. The routine never changed. At 3:12 a.m., Thomas would rise from the bed. Sometimes Margaret pretended to sleep. Other nights, she stayed awake as long as possible, hoping to catch the exact moment he moved. But there was something unsettling about the way Thomas seemed to sense her awareness. On nights when she remained tense and alert, he never left the bed. He slept peacefully beside her until morning. But the moment exhaustion pulled her into real sleep, the ritual returned. That discovery disturbed her more than anything else. It meant Thomas knew the difference between sleep and pretending. It meant his actions were not unconscious at all. They were deliberate. Margaret began to feel as though she were living inside a carefully maintained illusion. During the day, Thomas remained the same quiet, responsible man he had always been. But in the darkness of early morning, he became someone else entirely, someone who listened, waited, and watched the night beyond the windows. The children began to sense the tension in the house as well. Their son Daniel, who was 8 years old, started asking why his father walked through the hallway at night. Their daughter Claire refused to sleep with her bedroom door open anymore. She insisted that something outside the house made strange noises after midnight. Margaret tried to calm them with gentle explanations. Old houses made sounds. The wind moved branches across the roof. Night simply felt different from daytime. But even as she spoke those comforting words, she knew she did not believe them herself. One evening, Daniel approached her while she was folding laundry. "Mom," he said quietly, "why does Dad stand by your room at night?" Margaret froze. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. "I saw him," Daniel replied. "Last night I got up to get water. He was standing there in the hallway." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "What was he doing?" Daniel shrugged. "Nothing. Just standing there." He was looking at the front door. That detail settled in Margaret's chest like a stone. The front door. The same direction the muddy footprints always came from. That night Margaret made a decision she had been avoiding for weeks. If she wanted answers, she would have to see exactly what Thomas did during those silent minutes. Simply pretending to sleep was no longer enough. She needed to disappear completely. The following Monday, she prepared carefully. She went to bed earlier than usual and claimed she felt ill. She skipped her afternoon coffee so that exhaustion would come naturally. When Thomas turned off the lamp and settled beside her, she allowed herself to drift into genuine sleep. Hours passed. At some point deep in the night, she woke slowly, without moving. The house felt unusually still. Margaret kept her eyes closed and focused on her breathing, letting it rise and fall in the steady rhythm of someone deeply asleep. Then the familiar movement came. The mattress shifted as Thomas sat up. His feet touched the floor. He crossed the room quietly. But this time, he did not stop beside the bed. Instead, he continued toward the hallway. Margaret waited several seconds before opening her eyes. The bedroom door stood slightly open, and faint moonlight spilled through the gap. Her heart pounded as she slipped out of bed and followed him. The hallway floor felt cold beneath her bare feet. She moved slowly, placing each step carefully to avoid the creaking boards she had memorized over the years. Thomas stood in the living room near the front window. His back was turned toward her. The pale glow of moonlight outlined his shoulders as he stared out toward the yard. Margaret stopped several feet away and listened. For a long moment he did not move. Then she heard him whisper, "I know you're there." The words were soft but unmistakable. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. Thomas leaned closer to the window. "You always come back at this time," he murmured. His voice sounded strained, as if he were speaking to someone he both feared and expected. Margaret's pulse raced. There was no one outside. The yard lay empty beneath the moonlight. Yet Thomas continued speaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered. His shoulders trembled slightly. "It was supposed to be a joke." Margaret stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Thomas?" The sound of her voice shattered the silence. He turned slowly. For a moment, he looked at her with the stunned expression of a man who had been caught inside a private nightmare. His face had gone pale, and his eyes looked older than she had ever seen them. "You shouldn't be awake," he said quietly. Margaret crossed the room. "You've been doing this for weeks," she said. "Standing here in the dark, talking to no one." Thomas lowered his gaze. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable. Finally, he exhaled slowly and sank into the chair beside the window. "I was hoping you'd never see it," he said. Margaret waited. For years she had accepted Thomas's quiet nature without demanding explanations. But now the house itself felt like it was holding its breath. "What are you waiting for at this hour?" she asked. Thomas stared at the floor for several seconds before answering. "Not what?" he said softly. "Who?" A chill passed through Margaret's body. Thomas rubbed his hands together nervously. "It happened before we met," he said. "Back when I was 19. Margaret listened without interrupting. "There were 3 of us," he continued. "Me, a boy named Lucas Reed, and another friend from the docks. We used to sneak down to the old riverbank after work, drink cheap whiskey, talk about leaving town someday." His voice grew quieter. One night we dared Lucas to climb down onto the rocks below the bridge. Margaret's stomach tightened. He slipped, Thomas said. The word hung heavily in the room. He tried to grab the edge. Thomas continued, his voice shaking slightly. The water was high from the rain. The current was strong. Did you try to help him? Margaret asked gently. Thomas swallowed. I reached for him. He paused. But someone shouted that the police would blame all of us. Said we'd be charged for drinking near the docks. Said we'd lose our jobs. Margaret already knew what came next. So you ran, she said quietly. Thomas nodded once. We left him there. The room felt suddenly colder. Did anyone find him? Margaret asked. Yes, Thomas said. The next morning. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. And 3:12, she whispered. That was the time he went under, Thomas replied. His voice cracked. I remember looking at the watch on my wrist before we ran. Silence filled the room. For years I tried to forget, Thomas continued. But every spring, around the same week, I start hearing things again. Margaret felt a slow dread rising inside her. What kind of things? Footsteps, Thomas said. Water dripping on the porch. Knocking at the door that never comes. He looked toward the front yard again. And sometimes footprints. Margaret's breath caught. You've seen them too? She asked. Thomas nodded slowly. That's why I stand here every night, he said. To make sure he doesn't come inside. Margaret stared at him. The explanation sounded impossible. Yet somehow it also explained everything. Thomas leaned forward, his face buried in his hands. If I stay awake at that exact moment, he whispered, then the past stays outside. Margaret felt a cold realization settle over her. Thomas had not been watching her. He had been guarding the house from something he believed was still trying to return. And now that she knew the truth, one thought echoed louder than the rest. Guilt did not disappear with time. It simply waited for the right moment to be heard again. After that night, the house on Willow Street was never the same again. Knowing the truth did not bring Margaret the relief she had expected. In some ways it made everything heavier. Before, the fear had been shapeless, a vague sense that something was wrong but impossible to define. Now it had a name, a memory, and a time that arrived with cruel precision every night. 3:12 a.m. was no longer just a strange habit. It was the moment when a young man's life had disappeared beneath dark river water, and when Thomas Holloway believed the past tried to return. For several nights after their conversation, Margaret stayed awake beside him. She wanted to see what would happen now that the secret had been spoken aloud. When the clock approached 3:12, Thomas's entire body would stiffen with quiet anticipation. The same routine continued. He rose from the bed, crossed the room, and stood by the front window facing the empty yard. But now Margaret stood with him instead of pretending to sleep. Together they stared into the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the quiet neighborhood. Nothing appeared outside the house. No footsteps crossed the yard. No shadow moved between the trees. But the tension in Thomas never faded. He watched the night with the alertness of a guard waiting for danger that only he could see. His breathing remained shallow until the clock passed 3:13. Only then would he relax slightly and return to bed. Margaret tried to convince herself that now, with the truth revealed, the ritual would eventually fade away. Secrets lose power once they are spoken. That was what people often said. But the days passed and nothing changed. If anything, Thomas seemed even more fragile now that his past had been exposed. He began to sleep less during the early hours of the night, afraid he might accidentally miss the moment he believed mattered most. Dark circles formed beneath his eyes. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup in the morning. Sometimes he flinched when a car drove slowly down the street, as if expecting someone to step out and walk toward the house. Margaret realized that the memory he carried had never truly been about Lucas Reed alone. It was about the decision made in that single terrible moment, the moment when fear had convinced 3 young men to run instead of helping. Guilt, once planted deeply enough, could grow roots that lasted an entire lifetime. Weeks passed, and summer settled heavily over Savannah. The humid air made sleep uncomfortable, and the constant buzzing of insects outside the windows only added to the restless atmosphere inside the house. Margaret continued watching Thomas carefully, hoping to see some sign that he might finally let the past rest. But every night at 3:12, he still rose. He still stood at the window. And he still waited. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret sat with Thomas on the porch. The warm night air smelled faintly of river salt and magnolia blossoms drifting from somewhere down the street. Fireflies blinked lazily in the darkness. Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring toward the distant glow of the harbor lights. "I thought telling you would help," he said quietly. Margaret looked at him. "Has it?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "I don't feel as alone with it anymore," he admitted. "But it doesn't stop the feeling that he's still out there." Margaret reached for his hand. "Lucas died many years ago," she said gently. Thomas nodded, but the motion lacked conviction. "I know what the police report said," he replied. "I know what people believed happened." "But," Margaret asked. Thomas looked toward the street. "I left him there," he whispered. Those words hung heavily between them. Margaret understood something in that moment that no explanation could erase. Thomas was not afraid of a ghost. He was afraid of the version of himself who had run away that night. The memory had become a mirror he could never escape, and no amount of time could erase that reflection. By early autumn, Margaret reached a quiet conclusion she had been avoiding for months. Love alone could not repair a life built around unresolved guilt. She could stand beside Thomas and understand his pain, but she could not carry it for him. One morning, she packed a small suitcase while the children prepared for school. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She folded clothes carefully and placed them inside the bag. Thomas stood in the doorway watching her. "You're leaving," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. "For a while," she replied. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. Thomas did not argue. Perhaps part of him had expected this moment from the beginning. "Where will you go?" he asked. "My sister's house," Margaret said. "Across town." He looked down at the floor. "I never wanted to drag you into this," he murmured. Margaret closed the suitcase and faced him. "You didn't drag me into it," she said softly. "You kept it hidden until it grew too large for both of us." Thomas said nothing. They stood in silence for several seconds. Finally, Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You deserve peace," she said. "But you won't find it by standing at that window every night." Thomas looked toward the living room as if imagining the empty space beside the front window. "What if I stop watching," he said quietly, "and something really does come back?" Margaret held his gaze. "Then it will be something inside you," she said. He did not answer. Later that afternoon, Margaret left the house with the children and drove across Savannah toward her sister's neighborhood. The road curved along the edge of the river for several miles, and as she passed the old harbor docks, she caught a glimpse of the dark water moving slowly beneath the bridge. For a brief moment, she wondered if Thomas would ever stand there again, staring into the place where his past had begun. Weeks turned into months. Thomas wrote one letter during that time. The envelope arrived in early winter. Inside was a single page written in careful handwriting. He said he had spoken to a doctor about the sleepless nights. He said he was trying to learn how to forgive the frightened boy he had once been. Most importantly, he wrote one sentence that Margaret read several times before folding the letter closed. "Last night, I slept past 3:12 for the first time in years." Margaret never returned to the house on Willow Street. Years later, she heard through a mutual acquaintance that Thomas had eventually sold the property and moved to a small apartment closer to the harbor. Perhaps he needed to remain near the river that had shaped so much of his life. Or perhaps he simply wanted to face the place he had avoided for decades. Margaret never asked. Life moved forward in quiet but meaningful ways. She raised her children in a home where silence was not a warning and secrets did not grow in the dark. They learned that honesty, even when painful, was better than carrying invisible burdens alone. And now, sitting in her small apartment many decades later, Margaret understood something that had taken nearly an entire lifetime to learn. The most dangerous wounds are not always the ones people can see. Sometimes they are the quiet choices made in moments of fear. Sometimes they are the truths people hide from those who love them most. And sometimes they are the memories that return at the same hour every night, reminding us that the past does not disappear simply because we refuse to look at it. But Margaret also understood one final truth. Even the heaviest memories lose their power the moment someone finally speaks them aloud. Silence, after all, is what allows the darkness to grow.